Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So I'm not actually going to show slides. You're just going to have to look at my picture and at me. Because I have no equations that are relevant, no graphs, none of the things that one would normally put on PowerPoint slides. And I know that the people coming after me have really beautiful slides, and mine would not be, so is another reason not to have them. What I wanted to do was to talk about where we are with regard to issues of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, and in the context of the title of my talk, which is, what would Zilard do, given where we are now, in terms of the present conjuncture with regard to the crises of arms control and non-proliferation? So in my talk, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to sketch out quickly what I see as some of the important elements of the present conjuncture, the present crisis, and why it has deeper roots and greater dangers than one might think. And then secondly, address the question of what lessons would we learn from the experience of Zilart as one of the first generation of people to deal with the challenge of reducing the danger from nuclear weapons and working for their elimination. And so the first thing I want to do by way of sketching out the present danger is that I think most of us agree that long-standing arrangements that have been put in place to restrain nuclear dangers among the great powers have been unraveling. And it's not just the present issue with the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty with the United States and Russia having withdrawn from the treaty recently. And the treaty, as you know, has been in force for 30 years. And there is a bit of a 30-year rule that applies to some of the things that we've seen as part of this great unraveling. And that is that if you think back, this is not the first arms control treaty that has come undone. In 2001, the Bush administration withdrew the United States from the anti-ballistic missile treaty. And that also was basically 30 years old at that time. And now the remaining 30-year-long arms control process that started right at the end of the Cold War, the series of START treaties, the strategic arms reduction treaties, that no longer just capped the number of nuclear weapons, but began the process of reducing them for the United States and Russia. The most recent of these, the New START treaty, is set to expire in 2021. And there is great concern that it will not be renewed. And then that last remaining enduring restraint measure will be undone. So what we have is not just the present crisis that we can see and read about in the newspaper, but we've got this process of the unraveling of what previously had been taken for granted, which was that arms control was a ratchet that was in place and would stay in place and prevent the return to the kinds of arms racing and crises that we had seen in the past and that we thought we had got beyond. So now what we're doing is basically pushing the clock back to where we were, at least back into the early 1970s. The second thing that I think is worth paying attention to, and this is things that don't make the current news cycles, is that in the last 25 years, that there's been an effort at a whole series of measures at multilateral arms control that have failed to be realized as expected. And they were all part of what we saw and what we imagined as a step-by-step process to restrain the spread of nuclear weapons and to begin to reverse and roll them back with a view to their elimination. And the first of those, as most of you know, is that in 1996, there was the Comprehensive Nuclear Weapons Test Ban Treaty. And it's now 22 years, and it has still not entered into force. The United States has not ratified it, even though President Clinton signed it. And Israel has not ratified. India, Pakistan, and North Korea have not signed it. And there's no prospect of it entering into force. And the second treaty that has failed to materialize in the way that we had expected was that in the early 1990s, with the end of the Cold War, the United Nations gave a mandate for negotiations at the Conference on Disarmament for a treaty to ban the production of fissile material for nuclear weapon purposes, a fissile material cutoff treaty. So despite having had a negotiating mandate since the early 1990s, talks have still not started. Right? And the third element, the third treaty that one could have hoped for and possibly expected was that in 1994, China offered the other members of the United Nations Security Council, the United States, Russia, Britain, and France, a treaty on the no first use of nuclear weapons. That is, the 5 nuclear weapon states within the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as the permanent members of the Security Council, let's have a treaty that says we will not use nuclear weapons first. They presented a draft of that treaty, and there has been no negotiation and no agreement on this treaty. And the last element is that some of you may know that in 1996, the International Court of Justice presented an advisory opinion on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. This was a request made by the United Nations General Assembly, and the Court of Justice is the highest court in the United Nations system, and they passed for the first time an advisory opinion on what does international law have to say about the threat or use of nuclear weapons. And they said it would generally not be consistent with international humanitarian law and the laws of war. Despite this opinion, there has been no shift in the nuclear plans or postures of the nuclear weapon states. In other words, what they've done is to say, we don't care what international law has to say about this question. It does not affect how we see our nuclear planning going forward. So, things are unraveling. Things that could have happened and should have happened haven't happened. And now things are getting worse. They're getting worse in a couple of ways. One is that there are ambitious plans for nuclear weapons modernization. Those of you who were here yesterday heard some talks about that. And it's not just the US and the Russians doing modernization. All the 9 nuclear weapon states have plans or undertaking either expansions or development of their nuclear arsenals or modernization of them. And in some cases, these are going to put in place weapon systems that will be in operation for 60 or 70 or 80 years. Also, the conditions under which some states imagine using nuclear weapons are broadening, rather than becoming more and more restrictive. And this is evident, for example, in the new US Nuclear Posture Review, and also statements coming from Russia and Pakistan. The arms race in South Asia, which is what I had originally thought I was going to talk about, this was something that we could have prevented, but there has been no significant effort by the international community to try and prevent India and Pakistan developing their nuclear weapons since their nuclear tests of 1998. They now have an estimated 140 to 150 nuclear weapons each, and they have short-range, long-range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles. They are both putting nuclear weapons at sea, and in the case of Pakistan, developing battlefield nuclear weapons. And as we've seen in the last couple of weeks, they are in crisis, recurring crisis, where we now see nuclear armed states actually shooting down each other's fighter aircraft. The next crisis, this one thankfully seems to have passed for now. The next crisis between India and Pakistan may well mean that it begins from where we are as the minimum level of violence that they think they can safely undertake, and then they will ratchet up from there, which has been the pattern in the past, that each time they've had a conflict, they have decided that, okay, this stays underneath the nuclear threshold, so we'll start from that and move forward. And as the speakers who come after me are going to talk about North Korea and Iran, we have seen the United States withdraw from the Iran deal, and that raises profound questions about the future of nuclear restraint in Iran. And an opportunity has been missed in profound ways. And in the case of North Korea, if you think back to where we are, the US has been talking to the North Koreans, and the South Koreans have been talking to the North Koreans since the early 1990s about denuclearization. And you look to where we are now with estimates for the number of nuclear weapons North Korea has and the capabilities it has to deliver them, And we see a situation where the problem has got much worse than it could have been, and if this process fails to be realized in the kinds of ways that one might want, then we will have a much worse North Korea problem than we've had in the past. And the last part of it is, I think, there is actually an underlying structural crisis that we don't really often get to grips with. And the structural crisis is a bit like the structural crisis that was there in the Cold War, in that the legitimacy of the international order is actually what's being contested. The United States and the Soviet Union were actually contesting not just each other's nuclear weapons, but who gets to decide what happens in the world. And we are at a similar stage now where I think that a case can be made that there is a contest over the legitimacy of the international order. And one place that this is being played out that's relevant here is about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And as you know, next year, 2020, will mark 50 years since the entry into force of the NPT. And what we've seen in the last couple of decades is that the NPT process has gone into profound oscillations between the appearance of progress and the failure to make any kind of progress. And this, I think, has reached the point now where there are signs not just of cracks, but of potential failure of that as an architecture for managing the nuclear part of the international order. So in 1995, there was the coercive extension and indefinite extension of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. By coercive, I mean the United States and the other weapon states that were in the NPT forced an unconditional indefinite extension, because non-weapon states at that time were not happy with the lack of progress towards nuclear disarmament that had been promised in the treaty. So coercion was used to get that treaty through. But 1995 was a long time ago, and the balance of power in the world system, I think, has shifted significantly since then. So in 2000, there was agreement on 13 practical steps towards nuclear disarmament, where the weapon states promised 13 specific steps. None of them have actually been substantially met, because they included keeping the anti-ballistic missile treaty, bringing the nuclear test ban into force, and agreeing a fissile material cutoff treaty as three critical measures. None came to pass. In 2005, under the Bush administration, they failed to agree almost anything at all. And in 2010, under the Obama administration, there was a 64-point action plan. That tells you how much we needed to do, right? It went from 13 steps to 64-point action plan. And as well as the action plan, none of which, by and large, has been realized, there was a promise of a conference to establish a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. That conference has not taken place. So the promises that were made have just not been kept. And in 2015, they failed to agree a final document again. And in 2020, the prospects already look very bleak, because the United States, under the Trump administration, has already said, we're not going to talk about nuclear disarmament. We're going to talk about what it would take to create the conditions to talk about nuclear disarmament. And that's just basically saying the treaty may as well not exist now, because that conversation was had when the treaty was negotiated. And so reflecting this larger dynamic has been, as many of you will know, that in 2017, 122 countries at the United Nations agreed a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. I mean, this is a historic step. This is the first multilateral nuclear weapons treaty that came from non-weapon states. It was led by countries from the global south and civil society. Right? This is where people hoped back in 1946 we were going to get to with the US and Soviet plans to eliminate nuclear weapons before we had the horrors of the arms race. But the fact that they felt compelled to go through this process, despite the opposition of the nuclear weapon states, shows that they were willing to take a risk that they have never felt willing to take before. They were able to organize themselves in a way that they had not been able to organize themselves. And it's partly through this sequence of trial and error, of taking one step forward at these NPT conferences and other conferences, getting some kind of commitment, and then watching it dissolve, that eventually they realized that we can't have the weapon states just promise to deliver. We're just going to have to write the treaty and then see what we can do with holding them to account. And so far it's been signed by 70 countries and ratified by 22, which is actually not bad in terms of the timescale at multinational treaties. And it breaks fundamental ground on nuclear weapons in important ways. And one of those is that not just does it say that you can't develop, test, produce, manufacture nuclear weapons, it says you're not allowed to use or threaten to use nuclear weapons. It is a direct and unambiguous challenge to the doctrine of nuclear deterrence, that you cannot base your military and national security policy on the threat to use nuclear weapons. And how these countries of the ban treaty and the nuclear weapon states are going to resolve this fundamental challenge now to nuclear doctrines is something that is going to be work in progress for many years, and I'm going to come to that in a minute. But it does open the door for nuclear weapon states, should they become so enlightened, to actually join the treaty, either by giving up their nuclear weapons and joining, and then proving that after the fact that they've given them up, or that they can join and agree a verifiable, irreversible, time-bound, transparent plan for the joint elimination of their nuclear weapons. So this is a very different situation than many of us imagined that the arms control and disarmament and non-proliferation process was supposed to take. It's become much more confrontational and combative with a new set of actors. So what are the lessons from Zilard about all this? So as you know, Zilard pioneered efforts to address the challenge of nuclear weapons, as Joel said, as well as being one of the people that was responsible for helping initiate the Manhattan Project, and so ushering in the nuclear weapons age. And so I have a quote from Zilard that I want to use as a transition between the part I just had about how bad things are and where I want to go with this. And Zilard said, "It is not necessary to succeed in order to persevere. As long as there is a margin of hope, however narrow, we have no choice but to base all our actions on that margin." And I think that's where we are now back. We're at this question, at the issue of acting on the margins, but we have to act because the margin of hope is still there. And so I tried to distill down for myself some lessons from the life and work of Leo Szilard. And for those of you who haven't read it, I can highly commend Bill Lanowet's book, his biography of Szilard, Genius in the Shadows. It's just a great read and a great set of insights into that part of the scientific effort to deal with nuclear weapons from somebody who was both inside and outside the process. But I want to begin with something that actually happens before nuclear weapons and before Zilard's efforts to deal with that. And that goes back to a very early action that Zilard took. So in the early 1930s, Japan is establishing a colonial empire in China. And the League of Nations, the forerunner to the United Nations, was trying to intervene in that conflict. And the Japanese said, no, the League of Nations and the international community has nothing to say about what Japan does in China. And so Zilard took exception to this. And so in 1934, Zilard proposed a scientific boycott of Japan. And his argument was that we need to take sides in the cause of justice. And he says, okay, a mere protest by scientists would not be of any great value, but a pledge on the part of leading scientists to initiate and maintain a scientific boycott of Japan might help raise the issue, both in the Japanese scientific community and in the international community, that this is an injustice, that what Japan is doing in China is an obvious injustice, and we need to have it stopped. And he said that one hopes that our scientific colleagues in Japan will understand this is not about them. Right? This is about having them use their voice in Japan with regard to their society and their decision makers, that we are now being ostracized by the rest of the world because of what we're doing in China, and this has to stop. And Zilard's key argument was that even if it doesn't have great effect in the short term, what it does is and these are his words, it would serve to keep faith in the cause of justice. That scientists have to be on the right side of the issues that play out in the world, even if they have nothing to do with science, but we can throw in whatever weight we have into the process. So the first question is, what are the injustices today where the scientific community in the United States and elsewhere would merit a call for scientists to show that they have faith in the cause of justice? Because it's hard to separate claims about science and claims about truth and claims about justice. I mean, you can do it in a cynical way, but most scientists and the kind of self-image that we have as a community points us in that direction. And Zilard brought this up over and over again. So my question is, and it's an honest question, because what is going on in the world right now that has nothing to do with physics, but is so obviously unjust that we should speak up? I mean, it's not so strong here, but for many physicists and many scientists in many other countries, Israel's occupation of Palestine is sufficient grounds for a boycott. Stephen Hawking, among others, has actually participated in boycotting scientific activities and collaborations with colleagues in Israel and going to conferences because of the occupation. Right? But that's not the only injustice in the world, but it's an open question that, do we have the means and the mechanisms to have that conversation as a community about what we can and should be doing? The second lesson from Zilard that I wanted to kind of put on the table was that Zilard made a big deal about scientists taking responsibility for their work. And so the example here is this wonderful phrase that Zilard used about, he tried to organize what he called a conspiracy of silence. That after the first ideas about fission started to emerge, between 1936 and 1939, Zilard started lobbying all the physicists working on nuclear fission that he knew to not publish their work anymore. Right? And he actually wrote a letter to Lord Rutherford in 1936 saying, look, I'm so worried about the possible implications of fission and the possibility that if it does get out there, that it may be possible to make nuclear weapons. I'm going to stop publishing work on this. And then he started to write to others and saying, you should also hold back. Some of them did, and eventually others didn't. But this idea of a conspiracy of silence, where you take responsibility for the work that you do, leads to a question not just about, okay, I don't work on anything to do with weapons, so what can I contribute to this? I think one can read this in a larger frame. And the larger frame is one about, as a community, what does our work reproduce and make possible, as opposed to just individuals? So yesterday, Stuart Prieger, when he was giving his talk, put up a mention of the Göttingen Manifesto from 1957, where a group of leading and very eminent German scientists made a public declaration that none of the undersigned are prepared to participate in the creation, testing, or deployment of any type of nuclear weapon. Because there was a debate about arming the German military with nuclear weapons. They said, no, we just won't go there. And as some of you may know, in 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Hans Bethe made a public statement in which he said that I call on all scientists in all countries to cease and desist from work creating, developing, improving, and manufacturing nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. And so one can see this call to say, don't do this kind of work. But as a community, are we allowing and creating future weapon scientists? And should we separate these two things out, the individual responsibility for what you do and the collective responsibility of a community of what kinds of work we make possible. So one question I would pose to us as a community now, based on Zilard's example, is given that we have a new nuclear arms race taking off, and nuclear weapons complexes are going out actively recruiting the next generation of young scientists to go work in the weapons complex. Many of you will know this. Are there options and processes that we should undertake and a public deliberation to ask the question, what can we do to prevent the next generation of nuclear weapons and the next generation of nuclear weapon scientists? Even if we don't do the work ourselves, what are we going to do about this as a community? The third lesson from Zilard that I wanted to put on the table here is that Zilard was a great believer in kind of educating and pressuring decision makers. There's this endless stream of letters. I mean, his correspondence is amazing. He's writing to everyone he can think of all the time about all kinds of issues, and producing lots of petitions, gathering other people to sign on to his view of looking at things, or agreeing together with people to present options, possibilities, and to register public dissent. Right? So Zilard wasn't just private in his letters. He would get other people to join and petition and make some of those things public. And one of the ones that comes to mind is that it wasn't as directed necessarily to a president, but Zilard was part of the group led by James Franck in Chicago that produced the Franck Report in June of 1945 about the social and political problems of nuclear weapons and nuclear energy as they saw them coming out of the work of the Manhattan Project. And one section of it is the section I want to take a minute on, and that is where they raise the question of the possible use of nuclear weapons by the United States against Japan. And this is one of the first discussions that you see about how this handful of scientists, and the historical record suggests that it was basically James Franck and Zilard that kind of drove the train on this particular part of their report, about how to think about the use of nuclear weapons. And the first thing, as many of you will know, is that they said that the United States should desist from just dropping the bomb on a target in Japan, and they called for a demonstration. But the demonstration, they said, should be before the eyes of representatives of all United Nations. And it should be on a desert or in a barren island. And then the Japanese would see what a terrible thing this was, and hopefully that might convince them to surrender. But they went further than this. And this is the part I want to focus on. They said that after such a demonstration, the weapon could be used against Japan if a sanction of the United Nations and of public opinion at home could be obtained. In other words, it should not be in the sole decision of the president and the military of the United States to decide to drop the atomic bomb for the first time. This is something that has such grave consequences for humanity that it has to be a decision taken by basically the world as a whole and by American people, because they will carry the moral responsibility of this deed forever. So what would Zilard do now, given that policies of the first use of nuclear weapons are a core part of the policy of the United States and of some of the other nuclear weapon states? I mean, has the physics community and the scientific community actually taken a position on the US policy and the Russian policy and other policies of the first use of nuclear weapons? And if not, why not? And if we want to, what would be the best way for us to do this? Because the problem that they saw then hasn't gone away, it's actually become institutionalized. What was a possibility of first use is now a plan for first use. And so, two more and then I'll stop. Zilard was a great believer in using existing processes. So not just his stream of letters and petitions and meetings, but existing democratic processes and channels. And in 1952, Zilard proposed a lobby that, everybody has lobbies. Industrialists have lobbies, unions have lobbies, and there should be a lobby for peace. There should be a peace lobby in Washington, D.C., and a political action committee whose job it would be to raise money and influence presidential elections in the United States. And in 1962, 10 years later, this became the Council for a Livable World, which does exactly this work in D.C. And Zilard explained this decision to go from being organizing scientists to intervening in election campaigns by saying that I was led to conclude that the sweet voice of reason alone could not do the job. That campaign contributions could not do the job, but the combination of the sweet voice of reason and substantial campaign contributions might very well do the job. And so, following on from the conversations that were in this room earlier this morning about scientists and policymakers, and Andrew Zwicker talking about showing up and joining and running for election, and voting, there is a role in using democratic processes in every possible way that Zilard didn't just point to, but actually tried to institutionalize and get other people to institutionalize. And I think one of the things that we need to think about is how, as a community, if business lobbies can have so much power, if special interests of other kinds can have so much power, do we not have interests other than more funding for our research that require us to participate in these kinds of processes in a more organized and collective way, in the way that Zilard would suggest? And the last thing that I want to kind of lesson from Leo, so to speak, is that Zilard and Einstein and others put great faith in the possibility that if you educate fellow citizens, they will rise to the challenge. And so in 1946, they founded the Emergency Committee of the Atomic Scientists. And the office was 90 Nassau Street, which is just down the street from where the Program on Science and Global Security is. And they Einstein signed a fundraising letter that went out to physicists all over the world, asking in 1946 for $1 million. And the purpose was to educate people about the dangers of nuclear weapons. And there was this great 2 sentences in it, and with that, I'll kind of wrap up. And the sentences are, "We scientists recognize our inescapable responsibility to carry to our fellow citizens an understanding of the simple facts of atomic energy and its implications for society. In this lies our only security and our only hope. We believe that an informed citizenry will act for life and not for death." And I think this is our margin for hope. The democratic possibility that if we actually made the effort that the Emergency Committee of the Atomic Scientists and Zilard and Einstein and others labored so much at the beginning of the Cold War, and that had some momentum and then passed, that if we try again, given where we are today, with this narrow margin of hope to reach out to people and actually educate them about what's actually happening in the world as fellow citizens, not as privileged experts who say you have to trust us, but get citizens to exercise their rights and obligations and possibilities as citizens, that we do have space to try and begin to roll back the dangers that nuclear weapons continue to pose. So thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions. Please use the microphones. While we're waiting for somebody to ask a question, I'll share one of my own favorite Zilard quotes from his story, The Voice of the Dolphins, which I highly recommend. So Zilard wrote, "When a scientist says something, his colleagues must only ask whether or not it is true. If a politician says something, his colleagues ask, why did he say that? And only later they may or may not get around to asking whether or not it is true." First question?
Thank you very much. I just so appreciate that talk and your proposals and so forth. There certainly is an argument for scientists taking a position for justice, but only in a case where I think what's just is really clear. I think as soon as you go to the boycott Israel as as the example, and then I think you lose credibility with a lot of people. It's a much more complicated situation. It seems, and it's easy to boycott somebody else, but it seems to me that the greatest injustice we're facing now is in our own country. At the border, on the southern border, we're putting children in cages, separating families, ignoring all the laws about asylum. How do we boycott our own country, and how can scientists boycott a government that doesn't care about science anyway?
That's a great question. I have 52 seconds to answer it. One of the things that I think we can do is ask the consequence of what you've mentioned, which is the situation on the border and the government. And I think one way to ask that boycott, and people have proposed this, is connect it to your taxes. Yeah? Just like people refuse to pay taxes that would support military spending, people could choose not to pay taxes that have to do with supporting the government. If you disagree with the government's policy in such a fundamental fashion, then you should be willing to do what conscientious objectors do during wartime, which is to say, I will not use my money and allow it to be used to these kinds of purposes. I mean, Zilard reached the point where General Groves wanted to have him interned because he was dissenting so much. The question is, what is the issue worth to you?
Next question.
Hi, my name is Adam Yatsi. I'm from National Taiwan University. And I guess I also wanted to comment on this idea of scientific boycott, because I think this is very dangerous because it turns science from one of the beautiful things about science is that it's like a zone of almost frictionless international cooperation compared to, I can't imagine any other field. Like, you know, even during the Cold War, US and Soviet scientists collaborated. And my fear is that by making this might collapse scientific collaboration in places where the political situation is very fraught. For example, Sesame in Jordan is a very nice scientific collaboration on a collider. And then also, like, I currently live in Taiwan, and I don't it would be very bad for me and my scientific research if Chinese scientists were to boycott Taiwan because they don't agree with because of the conflicts there. And so I guess what do you say to that?
No, I mean, I see that perfectly reasonable. I mean, it wasn't that boycotts are the only thing that Zilard proposed. He also was one of the first people to propose that US and Soviet scientists should talk directly to each other about arms control issues. That led to the founding of Pugwash. So it's not that the only option available. There are times where you do have to create new channels for cooperation, exactly in the way that you describe, where governments may be hostile, and what you want to do is to open channels so that you can actually have cooperation and conversation. And the United States scientific community should do this with Iran. We should try and do it with North Korea. We should certainly do it with China, as people have mentioned in the last couple of days. There's been long-standing conversations between the US scientific community, China, and Russia. So that's all very positive. But there are times and situations where one has to ask the question, as Zilard did, is non-cooperation something that we should put on the table? Or are you going to take for granted that no matter what happens, no matter how unjust, no matter how terrible, we will stand outside this? That's all he was asking. And I'm just putting that question back on the table, that are there things that happen in the world that are so unjust that we decide that we can't remain outside that as a community?
Thank you.